Can everyone else hear me, I think? I see something in the chat about sound.
We can hear you.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Sounds good. I'm going to proceed then. I'm going to talk about sort of how I came to the housing issue for a little bit, and then talk about trends that we see both where I live and where you guys are in the Atlanta metro area, and then talk about what that could mean for the near future, not too long in the future anyway. I did title this post-pandemic housing, and then after I gave it some thought, I was like, are we really in the post-pandemic? I wasn't sure, so I hedged my bets there and have sort of my fingers crossed that we are indeed in the post-pandemic era and not, a permanent pandemic era or whatever else. So here's to hoping that you all can meet in person again soon, and that we can all live a more normal life than we have in the past couple of years. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I direct the Center for Business and Economic Research at the University of Arkansas. And one of the things that we do as a research project is maintain a huge real estate database in the state of Arkansas, and particularly in the Northwest section, which is the fastest growing section, or fastest growing part of the state. And so, that's where Walmart is headquartered, Tyson Foods, JB Hunt, and as a result, several Fortune 500s have offices based in Northwest Arkansas as well. So since about the late 90s, 2000s, and then certainly in the mid 2010s on, after the last recession, there's been tremendous growth in this area and a lot of interest in not only understanding what's going on in the overall economy, but what's going on specifically in the housing economy. So starting in 2004, my center actually started producing very detailed real estate data for the region, because there was a whole lot of housing being built in the region. And as you can imagine, for those of you that were around during the last recession or financial crisis or housing bust or whatever you want to call it, people were, maybe too few people were worried about, where all this housing being built was going to take us. And so the impetus behind us collecting all this data was to try to provide data for the local, for banks, for builders, so on and so forth, about exactly how much housing is being produced and what its absorption rate is. And so that's where we started collecting housing data from. And as I'll show you here in a little bit, it's sort of the curse of an economist to never be listened to, I guess. So you'll see that our data showed that we were overbuilding back before the Great Recession, and we are underbuilding now. And in both cases, I'm not sure that anybody really listens, but nonetheless, the reason I started talking about affordable housing and housing affordability issues and what housing would look like, has to do with not this period between 2020 and 2022, where we are today during the pandemic, when housing prices have skyrocketed nationwide. And as you can see here, for what we're tracking in Northwest Arkansas, the 3 counties, this is the pandemic-induced, big increase in home prices in our region. But, we started talking about housing affordability really around 2017, because we'd seen at that point over a 5-year time period, home prices had increased about 45% or so. And now over a 5-year period, they're close to 60% increase over a 5-year period. But back then, we were complaining about affordability. It was still, in this range, not where we are today. So we did have a head start in complaining about affordability. That doesn't mean that we've necessarily gotten very far in addressing the issues around it. But we did complete some studies and talk a lot about it. So we're probably well ahead of most communities that are dealing with affordable housing that have come to that issue in the last couple of years. So we've already gotten most of the talking out of the way. So, just for reference, in Benton County, which is where Walmart is headquartered, the average home price is about $350,000. And in Washington County, it's about $13,000, both about 16% increase last year. Within the cities in that county, the major cities, Fayetteville, Bentonville in Benton County, and Fayetteville in Washington County, home prices are way higher than that. So reason we're seeing home prices in our market increase, obviously, in the last couple of years, it's been people working from home, wanting bigger space to live in, Those of us that have gotten comfortable working from home have converted parts of our home into an office, like I have myself here, which I will point out is rated 9 out of 10 by room raters. So uh, there are a lot of people that wanted more space, and that spurred quite a bit of home buying in our market, like we've seen in all markets around the country. In addition to that, given the kind of low levels of building going on, we're seeing quite a bit of investor activity in our market as well. The overall home ownership rate in the two counties has declined quite dramatically over the last several years. So a lot of people are buying up homes with cash offers. A lot of investors in our market that are buying and then turning around and renting them. Entire subdivisions get bought up at times, or half subdivision gets bought up and put on the rental market at various times. So all of that, is exacerbated by the pandemic. So, want to point out that the reason why we started talking about housing affordability in 2017, and that situation hasn't changed during the pandemic, is because, after a drop off in our population growth after the last recession, we started, growing at a level that was just below where we were in the mid 2000s before the Great Recession. And you'll see that we were adding anywhere between 11, 12,000 people each year to this region in this two county area, which, roughly averages out to about 30 people a day moving in. If you want to be really rough, produce some really rough estimates, that would necessitate about 10 housing units to be added every single day if you're adding about 30 people to your region. We're not anywhere close to producing 10 housing units. We were never close to producing 10 housing units a day at any point in the last decade. And so to give you an idea of kind of why we didn't build as much housing in this decade compared to the last decade, I kind of show the population growth and housing production in the 2 decades. So between 2000 2010, which we'll call the previous decade, and then 2010 and 2020, which we'll call the most recent decade, you can see that we did, clearly overbuild in that previous decade, and we clearly underbuilt during this decade. And as I pointed out, this is sort of a curse of the economist, I guess. If sometimes you're, most of the time we're wrong, I'll admit that, but sometimes you're right, and then nobody listens to you because most of the time you've been wrong. So you'll see, during the last great housing boom before the Great Recession, before we had really good technology and GIS software and county data that was on GIS software, we actually used to send students to drive active subdivisions in Northwest Arkansas. So subdivisions being built, we put 2 students in a car, pieces of paper with plats in their hand, and they would drive the subdivisions and mark off lots. This one's under construction, this one's completed, this one's completed and unoccupied, this one's completed and occupied. And that was the metric we were really looking for overbuilding: houses that were completed but not occupied. And so if you think back to that movie that some of you might have watched, The Big Short, there's a scene where Steve Carell's character and a couple of others go into a housing subdivision in Florida, and they're just walking around, knocking on doors, trying to see if anybody lives there. We do something very similar to that, except we don't let the students get out of the car, walk around and knock on doors. We just have them sit in the car and kind of case the house from the curb, if you will, where they observe for signs of living, curtains, landscaping, cars parked in the driveway or something like that, to assess whether a house is occupied or not. And so during the Great Recession, or before the Great Recession, as early as 2006, we could show people in our region that we were overbuilding. There are all these houses at a point to 2,000 houses sitting complete but unoccupied in our region. And, people tended to ignore this data and continue to overbuild. We did have a crash, and now we're functionally at 0 unoccupied homes. So we still track these homes, largely do it with technology these days, but some subdivisions are being built so fast that the county doesn't even put them in the GIS system fast enough that we do actively drive those. And at no point have we drive them twice a year or check them twice a year. At no point have we seen the same house remain unoccupied twice in the same year. So the houses that are being built are completely absorbed. And this is for the smaller county in Washington County, where you see the number of unoccupied homes reached close to about 1,000. So what has happened is that, we overbuilt in the last market. We absorbed all of those houses by 2012, 2013 in this market, and I think in a lot of markets around the country as well. But then that last recession either made people afraid or cleared out a lot of smaller developers from the market because they went bankrupt. And as a result, we've not seen the level of building needed to maintain the level of building that we would need for this level of population growth. And as a result, this is a national index, again, showing home prices. You can see that home prices have steadily increased, after they reached bottom somewhere around this point, and then, shot up even further during the pandemic. So obviously, as I alluded to, the pandemic-induced buying is sort of built upon some of the larger issues and long-term issues that we had in the housing market. As I mentioned, people wanted more space. They left rental markets or wanted larger houses. But as we've seen across the board, it's not just that people are leaving rental units and buying single-family homes or buying homes. There's as much demand for rental housing as there is for single-family housing. But as I said, this was built upon a longer period of time. This shows you housing production against population growth, and this is a chart the CEA produced, I believe, last year, and it generally shows us that in general, we have not produced the level of housing needed to keep up with population growth. So coming into the pandemic, we were already in a situation where we were not producing enough housing to keep up with the population growth. Then we had factors, where we had pandemic-induced buying, and all of a sudden you have great demand for lumber at a time when lumber mills had sort of shut down during the early part of the pandemic because they were afraid people wouldn't be buying houses. But they were wrong. People bought a lot of houses. Lumber prices skyrocketed, dropped down last year, skyrocketed again this year, and is now headed on its way down, I guess, with the Federal Reserve raising rates here recently. So if I were to kind of summarize that period of what's been happening in the last several years, not just the pandemic, but the last several years, I would use this GIF that is courtesy of the movie Smokey and the Bandit. So I know I'm not old enough to have watched this movie in the movie theaters, but I was old enough to watch this movie when it was, constantly on network TV. And so the Pontiac in this case is population growth. Your 18-wheeler is home prices. And those poor cop cars, the back end, are sort of housing production, trying to keep up with. And you can see that, let's assume that this is the period before the pandemic, and this was already the case where home prices are growing way faster because housing production is not keeping up with population growth. And then you have a situation like the pandemic happened where lumber prices skyrocket and housing production drops off again. And so, home prices actually just plowed into the housing production picture again at that point. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about this period before the pandemic, because I think if we resolve the underlying issues in the housing market, not that I have high confidence that we're going to resolve the underlying issues in the housing market, but if we address the underlying issues in the housing market from before the pandemic, I think we'd have a much better chance of dealing with housing affordability as we see it in different markets across the country, including yours, mine. Obviously, what's going on in your market and what's going on in my market is not nearly as bad as what's going on in some of the coastal markets. But the housing affordability issue, which used to be a coastal issue, is now started to spread to sort of, I guess you guys are not Middle America, but we were very much Middle America, and it started to spread here. It started to spread in markets that are not exactly San Francisco and New York and Seattle and LA and places like that. So really going to talk about this period between, say, 2012, when we seem to have reached bottom of the home prices, all the way to before the pandemic, and what caused that increase in home prices during that time period. So I think the first thing to note is that a lot of people have been moving recently, and this moving is related to retirement, it's related to jobs. And so this colorful chart here gives you an idea of where people are born, and it shows you in each state whether people living there were born outside the United States, somewhere else in the United States, or somewhere within that state. And you can see along these coastal states, for example, the percentage of people that were from other states moving to California, for example, has decreased over time. Again, people are not willing to move to California a whole lot from other states because home prices there are very expensive. And you'll see that along the coasts to some extent, but along the middle of the country, you'll note that the light blue portion, which is people moving from other states to those states, has been increasing, and that includes the states sort of around the southeast of the United States, largely because, the economic growth has been fairly good in these. Now, obviously, the economic growth has not been as good as some of those cities in California or in Seattle or places like that. But the economic growth in where we are, Northwest Arkansas, where you guys are in Atlanta, has been pretty good. That people are willing to move to these not new metro areas, but to these metro areas to look for jobs, better quality of life, and cheaper housing. In addition to that, in the last several years, at least to our market, and I don't know how it is in Atlanta, we've had people move from Oregon, California, Colorado, not necessarily, and these aren't people moving from LA or from Portland or from San Francisco or from Seattle, but they're moving from smaller communities in those states to our state and our region. The home prices are still a little bit cheaper in our community compared to where they're coming, but they were not really moving for any of those reasons as much as it was for fire. I mean, wildfires have been essentially burning them out of their neighborhoods and their communities. And so they started moving, towards the south and the east of the country, where thankfully we really, as at this point, don't have a whole lot of wildfire related concerns. We have all kinds of other weather related concerns, including, I assume you're having or might be having the same system that's going through Arkansas right now. You're probably getting it in either later today or tomorrow at some point. So, but we have seen a lot of people move from the West to our region and to other parts of the Southeast because, I guess wildfires are sort of an outsized concern, and people rate those issues much higher than they would the likelihood of being hit by tornadoes or things like that. But you are, in some sense, moving from west to the southeast, trading one sort of natural disaster for a different kind of natural disaster. Although I guess the effects of our natural disasters here, tornadoes, tend to be far less wide-ranging than wildfires tend to be. Again, we're sort of in a hilly area here where I live, and we used to not get tornadoes here at all. We've had two in the last 4 or 5 months, which is completely new for us. So, people that have been tracking wildfires know how to get very good at tracking tornadoes. But in general, there's been a lot of people moving within the United States, particularly to the southeast, which is what I'll call this, roughly map here, which roughly corresponds to the Southeastern Conference. So much like those football teams that are trying to get into the Southeastern Conference, everybody else is trying to live in the Southeastern Conference as well, because for a variety of reasons, as I've mentioned, the Southeastern Conference is pretty good, both for football and for quality of life. My apologies to the two schools in that area that are in the ACC and Sun Belt. I do know that Georgia Tech was once upon a time in the Southeastern Conference and probably regret the decision to move to the ACC and probably look longingly at coming back to the SEC. And given our expansion in the past several years, we probably welcome them back. So in addition to people moving, we also have people my age. So I am a millennial. I found out that I guess I'm an older millennial. So I guess not just a normal millennial, but people my age have been buying houses in the last half decade. And the economy for millennials seemed to improve around 2014. So if we think back to the hangover from the Great Recession that we had, it took a very long time for the economy to get back to full steam. Didn't really happen to some measure till about 2014. So around 2014, millennials like moles emerged from their parents' basements and started wanting to buy homes. I myself bought a house in 2014, close to the bottom of the market, housing market in Northwest Arkansas, where I live. So yes, as an economist, I'm able to predict some things correctly and waited long enough to buy a house and timed it well enough. So millennials are starting to buy homes. Obviously, coming out of their parents' basement, they don't need a whole lot of space, so they're looking for smaller homes, starter homes. But that's really not a thing that we've constructed in this last decade in particular, and we'll talk about why that is here shortly. But you'll see that we want to buy homes, we want to buy smaller homes. There aren't a whole lot of smaller homes available. In addition to just millennials wanting to buy homes, millennials want to buy homes in very particular kinds of areas. And so you look at all these different ranking metrics that you have out there from US News or a variety of different places. I have my region up top, and I've cropped it in a way to show you that we ranked better than Austin, Texas in the most recent US News World Report Best Places to Live. That's why I cropped it that way. But again, you look at these scores for quality of life and, kind of amenities that go along with that. People have museums, bike trails, kayaking facilities, hiking facilities, a lot of bars, restaurants, craft breweries, and those types of activities the millennials are really looking for. Very, compared to the newer generation, I guess our generation is a little more social and wants that very social, a lot of social spaces available in your cities. And so they're moving to all of these cool cities that make these rankings. And then I have, cropped from the Sandy Springs website in Georgia, for example, which is again a place that a lot of people want to move to, and shows up in a variety of different rankings as being a really good place to move to in the state of Georgia. So, millennials are not just buying homes, but they're also moving to places that are making these lists. And as a result, home prices specifically in these regions that have invested in amenities, have really good job market, are attracting a lot of millennial buyers of homes. And given that we're not producing a whole lot of homes, what we're seeing happening in these markets is that land prices in those markets continue to increase. And so this is, I think, my underlying case for why we have sort of a housing affordability crunch. It's been with us for a while. The underlying issues, again, are longer than this past decade. It's just that we're not going to be able to address these issues until we address some of these underlying issues that have sort of been around since the 70s and 80s across the United States. And so when you have a lot of people move to a region, you want to build a lot of housing for them. If you want to build a lot of housing for them, you got to do two things. You either got to, spread out with the land available around your metro area or your city, or you build up. And as you can see, the land that, generally cities that are cool are generally landlocked in the sense that they have fixed boundary, they're not able to annex additional land and so on and so forth. And so the land within those cities or that metro area is quickly diminished by new housing production. And so very quickly after the last recession and before the last recession, most of the available land was easily got developed with single family homes. And over time, the remaining land available to develop within these metro areas continues to get more expensive. And you're, as a developer, have two choices. So you have a very expensive piece of land here, and this chart showing you our metro area, which is the northwest part of Arkansas that you see here. You can see that our land share of the final price of a home has increased quite significantly in the last decade. A very similar situation in the Dallas metro area you see here, but in central Arkansas, in our state, that's not growing. You don't see a similar situation. Most of the city of Memphis, obviously some of the suburbs of Memphis see some land price appreciation. And then, places that are close to Northwest Arkansas, Tulsa, Oklahoma City, again, you're not seeing that kind of land price appreciation because, again, you're not seeing a whole lot of people wanting to move to those particular metro areas as much as they are wanting to move to Northwest Arkansas and Dallas, close to where we are. And as a result, developers have two choices. They can either build really large homes and sell them for a lot of money after paying for expensive land, or build a lot of homes on the same piece of land and then sell that for lower sticker value, but still make the same amount of money. And, as we've seen, developers tended to build larger homes, both in our market and, as I'll show you, in your market as well. And so this, from the Center for Neighborhood Technologies, gives you an idea of housing affordability in two different ways. The traditional way of measuring housing affordability, which is simply to look at sticker price of the home and see if somebody's paying more than 30% of their income, which is what you see on the left here. And gives you an idea. Again, our region doesn't have one large city; it's four big cities: Fayetteville, Springdale, Rogers, and Bentonville, which is sort of the blue areas that you see here. And housing within those cities tends to be more expensive than 30% of someone's income. And then when you leave the cities, go into the suburbs of these cities, you'll see that housing tends to be a lot cheaper. But then when you look at it with transportation added in, the chart is sort of reversed, where you have within the cities again being more affordable, where less than 45% of someone's income is being spent on housing and transportation. Whereas as you move away from the cities into the suburbs, more than 45% of your household income is being spent on housing and transportation. If you want to look at it from a climate perspective, same story. People that live, again, we don't really have any decent public transportation system at all. So even people that live within the cities are very car dependent. Unless you're really willing to commit to this walking, biking, or scooting lifestyle that you can get away with in some of our downtowns. But most people are car dependent, but again, greenhouse gas emissions per household is lower in our major cities compared to some of the suburbs. And so this is, the CBSA that has the Atlanta metro region in it. Again, you see the land price appreciation over the last decade compared to some of your surrounding regions, which again, with the expensive land available, housing tends to be cheaper in outlying areas from the city compared to the city itself. But then when you look, once you take into account transportation prices, you can see again that chart is somewhat reversed, where you have the affordability being a lot more expensive away from the city. And you guys actually have some metro lines that run on your marked system. So, again, like Northwest Arkansas, even though you do have metro lines in your community, you still tend to be a lot more car dependent. And so greenhouse gas emissions are not that dramatically different, but they are very different between the outlying areas and the central part of the city where you have the metro region. So, with the availability of land diminishing, as I'd mentioned, across the country and in my metro area and in your metro area, you see largely single family homes being built and not multifamily homes. We're not seeing duplexes. We're not seeing triplexes. We're not seeing fourplexes being built. We're largely seeing single family detached housing being built for the market of millennials that want smaller homes, not able to get the smaller homes. I myself was in that same boat, even though I bought close to the bottom of the last market in 2014. We're a DINK household. DINK stands for dual income, no kids. So we have a 3-bedroom house. There's no good reason why we need 3 bedrooms other than that was the house that was available within our price point. So we bought it. And then the pandemic happens and you end up decorating one of your rooms to be your home office. But that was not why we bought a 3-bedroom house. We just bought it because that was what's available. So when a limited amount of land is available, you see a lot of them building single family homes as opposed to duplexes, triplexes, or multiplexes of that size, which we'll call the missing middle housing. So obviously some people want single family detached housing, but a lot of people will be happy buying within a duplex, a triplex, or a fourplex. But the majority of, say, Sandy Springs, where people want to move, is zoned specifically for single family detached housing. In fact, about 85% of Sandy Springs is zoned for single family housing. Close to about 90% of my region is zoned for single family housing. And so when you look at land prices going up and then developers choosing to build really large homes and sell them for a lot of money instead of building smaller homes and duplexes and triplexes, the reason they're largely doing that is because cities prevent them from responding to high land prices by building greater density, by requiring them to build single family detached housing And you'll see in your communities as well as in my community a plethora of other zoning regulations that affect building. And so when we look at this from a national perspective, again, these are charts from the Walton Housing Regulation Index, Residential Land Use Index. And so it shows you communities across the country that have become more restrictive in the last decade. So that's what this chart shows you. That's my community right here. We've become more restrictive in the last decade for our land use. And that's you guys over here, become more restrictive in the last decade for land use. And this chart here shows you that the more restrictive a community is, this is along this x-axis here, you see communities being more restrictive. And then along the y-axis, the higher the number, the better, the more affordable your community is. So the more you move along this way, you see that communities become a lot less affordable. And that in part has to do with the fact that if there is a limited amount of land available in these cool cities like Sandy Springs or Northwest Arkansas or Austin, Texas, then the way to respond to that limited amount of land is to allow those regions to build denser housing, to build duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes for people to buy those instead of being forced into buying large single-family detached housing. But communities largely do not zone for that in most of our cities. In addition to not zoning for single family homes, we have sort of weird requirements that that take up a lot of land that doesn't need. So even if we want to build sort of a dense subdivision of single family detached housing, we're often not allowed to do that in our various cities because we have sort of weird driveway length requirements, lot width requirements, how much space needs to be left between two lots, and all of these different rules that are in your code books that have been handed down since the 60s and 70s for a variety of different reasons and have not been changed since that point. So like, even if you want to build a denser single family detached housing subdivision, you're not allowed to do it because you don't meet all these requirements about how wide your lot needs to be or how many parking spots need to be available on the driveway and all of these different rules that are in there. So communities that have responded well to this can do so in one of two ways to deal with this expensive land, trying to build more dense housing. And one community that has actually done well, which would be a surprise to maybe most of us, but looking around to try to understand what's been going on, sort of seen the future of where you can get away with, you have a limited amount of land available and you try to make it denser and more affordable to your location. And that future is really seen in the home of Chuck Grassley, of all people, in the state of Iowa. The city of Des Moines has done a very good job in the last decade of trying to build more housing in their downtown area to accommodate more people. And as a result, you see within the city of Des Moines and their MSA, closer into the city, land's share of the final price of the home actually grew by a much smaller amount than what you see going on in the outlying areas away from the city. And again, when you look at the housing affordability metric that I showed you just a little bit earlier, Des Moines, the city itself, is affordable on both charts. So you're looking at housing affordability 30% just for the housing, under 30%. And then when you include housing and transportation, the city itself is under 30%, under 45% there, the household income being spent on housing and transportation. And the reason they've gotten away with doing this, or the reason they've been able to do this, is they've actually dramatically increased the amount of housing available in the downtown part of Des Moines. And so in the last decade, their downtown increased by about 82%. It accounted for about a third of the overall increase of the city's population. And they've built more than half of all the housing units that got built in the last decade in Des Moines got built in the downtown region. So they have converted. Now, this picture is hilarious because it's the single worst picture of a downtown anyone's ever taken. All you see is a bunch of parking lots. If it's simply taking a picture from the other side, you actually get a picture of the housing development and all the activity going on in downtown Des Moines. But this is one way of dealing with housing affordability. So this is something that your communities, Sandy Springs, the city of Atlanta, here in Northwest Arkansas, can really do to address housing affordability is to build a lot more housing in places that people want to live. I mean, these places that have your bars, your restaurants, your craft breweries, uh, biking trails, and all of these different amenities that people want to be around. And so it's better to just put, and of course, jobs. So it's a lot better to just put the housing where people are. The other way that we've seen a lot of development, both in your community and ours, this is a picture, the picture from on the top is, I believe, the Northridge Shopping Center in Sandy Springs. And the picture below is a similar strip mall in my community here in Fayetteville. And you can see, again, there are a lot of these types of strip mall developments. So these aren't necessarily the downtown regions of our cities, but there are a lot of these strip mall developments that are just basically a bunch of asphalt with maybe one store still struggling to survive in there. And that is an area that already has a lot of infrastructure going to it. It has roads, it has electricity, very often has water and sewer, although some of that capacity might need to be increased to deal with residential uses. But generally, these are in places zoned simply for commercial development. And over time, I believe the city of Sandy Springs has paid a consultant to sort of develop plans to redevelop that Northridge shopping center in Sandy Springs. Similarly, we've had, so this is the same top and bottom picture. This is Sandy Springs, this is Fayetteville, this is Sandy Springs, this is Fayetteville. You see, very similar ideas being presented in both areas. You're taking a strip mall development that generally has a decent topography, nice tree cover, so on and so forth, nice roads running around it, good access to it. And here are the plans in Northridge to develop, various forms of housing, multifamily units, so actual apartments, then duplexes, triplexes, and single family housing as well. So a whole variety of housing for people that want that variety of housing. And then you see similar situation here in Fayetteville. You have a bunch of multifamily housing being developed, along with some hotels and other developments going into that strip mall that was very much underutilized, dilapidated, so much so that the city tried to improve it by painting murals on it, but most of those buildings are demolished at this point. And I believe this is still a plan. No action has been taken in Sandy Ridge. This is actually all under construction. Most of this construction has already happened, so people will be moving into this region in Fayetteville. So the future for post-pandemic housing is really two different avenues. One, we will need a lot more downtown development going on. I don't have a picture to show you in Sandy Springs or in Fayetteville, but I did have a picture to show you in Des Moines, because our cities are not necessarily doing that type of development. Our cities are sort of handling this other low-hanging fruit here of trying to redevelop the strip malls, rezoning commercial areas to make them mixed use and provide residential uses as well. So those are the two ways communities can address the housing shortage. Again, this takes a lot of time to do. I believe City of Sandy Springs had 3 sites marked out for this type of development somewhere in 2018 or 2019, and no actual development has taken place as of this point. There are a lot more strip malls in my community too that can easily get redeveloped. This is just one that is being redeveloped, so there's a lot more that needs to be done. All that obviously needs to be done against this backdrop where we are today. So when we first started talking about housing affordability, mortgage rate was not a concern. Mortgage rates were generally under 4%, usually in the low 3%. Today, mortgage rates are, if not for some buyers, already at 5%, very close to 5% in a lot of different markets. Every time mortgage rates have gone up, new home sales have declined. And this is what this chart shows you. Is this time going to be different? I think it might be slightly different for one reason, that we've underbuilt housing in the entire last decade. So there's still a lot of people that want to buy housing and could afford to buy housing even when mortgage rates are about 5%. But there's no way around the fact that some people are gonna drop out of the home buying market for a time period while rates continue to increase, go into 5% and maybe up to 6% eventually. So home buying is not going to be as robust in the next couple of years with mortgage rates as high as they are. It's anyone's guess as to where mortgage rates will head back down. I figure we'll eventually head to another recession. The Federal Reserve will cut rates and probably purchase mortgage-backed securities like they did again, and rates will start trending back down. So I don't expect mortgage rates to continue to increase forever. Eventually they'll come back down, but between now and then, there is obviously going to be a lot less home buying than we've seen in the last 2 years, which should, as we've seen in an earlier chart, reduce lumber prices, which they're already going down, which should make the house construction price go down. But then housing loans, the construction loans that builders are involved with, are getting a lot more expensive. Labor has always been expensive in the construction industry. It's getting even more expensive in the last couple of years. So we should see some improvement in the construction cost of a home. But if we don't deal with the underlying issue of trying to reduce the land price of the final finished homes by rezoning, making more denser housing development possible, we're not going to be able to address the overall housing affordability issue, even if we address lumber prices, mortgage rates, and even construction labor issues with more immigration. So that said, I'm going to let you guys throw your questions or angry comments at me, whichever works. I did speak for all millennials. I am an elder millennial, so I will take that mantle of talking about what kind of housing we want and where we want to live.
Thanks, Mervin. Hey, it's Mike Scordellis. So lots of stuff there, of course, and I was surprised with the Smokey and the Bandit reference, which is very good. Bravo. Anytime you can mention that, but you didn't mention Buford T. Justice, which was Jackie Gleason's character, that he was the actual Smokey in that. In any case, and you can't really have a lot of quotes, at least with mixed company, because most of them are some variation of off color, literally or figuratively. But lots of things in here to unpack. And you touched on a couple, and certainly folks jump into the Q&A. There's a couple questions there. I'm going to get to them in a second. But Mervin, you touched on a couple, certainly land use and planning, which we don't do enough of. And of course, most communities take a very myopic view, which for them is what their constituents want, but for the greater good is obviously counterproductive and drives up price, which, again, myopically feels good, but macro feels really bad, and doesn't serve us well. But you touched on migration a little bit, certainly to the SEC and what have you, but we've also had this with a backdrop, certainly because of the pandemic, but even a little bit prior to the pandemic, due to various reasons, and I won't go through them, we haven't had immigration to the levels that we had in the past. So we're struggling to have enough housing units without immigration. Can you just touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, I remember seeing a chart a while back that showed that, the amount, if the immigration levels stayed where they were in 2018 or so, there would be 1.5 million more people that would have moved to the United States during that time period. So that obviously predated the pandemic. There was policy changes from the Trump administration that led to the reduced immigration levels and have continued to this day, somewhat spurred by the pandemic, but also we're just not providing nearly as many refugee and asylum status claims as we used to before 2019. So yes, that is a portion of why we've seen home price increases. But like as I showed you in that chart, the immigration contribution to population increase in most of the states tend to remain along the coasts. Yes, immigrants are moving to Northwest Arkansas, are moving to the Atlanta metro area, but not nearly as much as they are, say, moving to New York or California or places like that. So it's mostly the migration, the increase in population that you saw in your metro area and my metro area. 85% of it generally comes from in migration from other people that were born in the United States and other parts of the United States that are moving to these metro areas, and it's not really international immigration. So That is more of a concern in the bigger metro areas along the coast. That's where immigrants tend to go. And, so they've had housing affordability issues longer than most of us. And, that against a backdrop of reduced immigration in the last several years. But our migration is largely people moving around within the United States, again, seeking different quality of life, maybe a slightly slower pace, a little more space. And that's why you see them moving into the Southeast. And then again, I know Atlanta is way hotter than we are here in Northwest Arkansas, but we do tend to get 4 seasons in many parts of this area that people are moving into. So you do get a summer, you get a winter. Winters are a little bit milder than they are from where people are moving from. Maybe summers are a lot hotter, but we do have nice indoor air conditioning around here. And then, in times like this, today there's just, raining cats and dogs outside. So.
You actually touched on one of the pieces that one of the questions was asking about, which was a little more specific to here in the Atlanta metro, but the latest CPI print, the rent of primary residence piece nationwide was up 4.4. Well, kind of first, does that seem reasonable to you? And then the other is kind of more specific to Atlanta. And of course, you don't know our market quite that well, though you did a little research, which was great. Is it a lot higher because we're seeing some of these not just rental increases, but also more institutional buying and not mom and pop of single family homes for rental purposes? Again, you touched on that a little bit. So if you could address that, like, do you believe the 4.4 nationwide kind of thing? And then a little bit more on the.
There are some very good specifics, and I'm not the expert on CPI, how specifically it's calculated, but there's a difference between what somebody is going out to lease today, and as a result, if they go out in the last year or the year before that, well, maybe not 2020, rents were going down in 2020, but within the last year, if you went and signed a new lease, you obviously paid a higher price than somebody that's been in a renting situation for several years and their prices haven't increased as much. So it takes a while for those measures to get into the CPI, in the sense that only the people going out and signing a new lease are facing the higher rents and everybody else has not. And then it takes a while for that to get into the owner's equivalent rent as well, in the way CPI calculates it. So actually over the next couple of months, we expect the CPI to go up, in part because what hasn't happened yet is going to go into the way they measure housing inflation. And so CPI will be going up in the next several months, not because of used cars or any of these things, but because of the way it's calculated. Housing price increases that have happened in the last couple of years are going to eventually get into the CPI metric. So that's going to happen. It just hasn't happened in the CPI measure yet. We've seen a lot of, to answer your second question about whether people are moving, there are indeed a lot of people moved for remote work. I don't know how many of those people are permanent residents as opposed to sort of long-term residents. And so some of them obviously didn't mind that they rented a single family house. That's perfectly acceptable. They don't want to necessarily, if they're not sure that they want to live in your metro area or my metro area, and they came from California or one of these places, perfectly acceptable to rent for a long period of time. We're not sure that we're going to be able to keep them or not. It entirely depends on whether their offices require them to come back in some hybrid form, and so on and so forth. But statistics that we've seen, the National Association of Realtors indicated that in January and December, close to about a quarter of homes were bought on all cash offers. Little less than a quarter of homes were bought by people actually classified as investors. And I think in larger markets, in larger home buying markets, if you think about Phoenix and places like that, you're seeing a lot of national investor groups buying homes. You're not really seeing that in my market, and I don't know to what extent you're seeing that in Sandy Springs, for example, but you might be seeing it in Atlanta. You don't see the national REITs buying entire subdivisions, but what we've seen here is that just wealthy buyers buying half a subdivision and then renting them out. And at any given point, there needs to be a mix of, housing available. Not everybody wants to buy. Not everybody can buy for a variety of different reasons. So some amount of rental single-family homes is perfectly acceptable in the market. But the amount of investor activity that we've seen in the last couple of years only exists. So if you ever read the earnings calls from some of these REITs and investor groups that are buying entire subdivisions, they explicitly tell you that the reason they buy this is because they view it as a safe investment. The prices will only appreciate, rents will only go up. Why did they believe this? Because they do not believe that the communities that they're buying homes in will authorize enough residential development, enough dense residential development to reduce home prices in their region. So they're telling you specifically why they think it's a profitable decision, and it's entirely up to communities to prove them wrong by authorizing more denser housing development, by rezoning existing strip malls, which nobody wants. I mean, they're a blight on most of our communities. Is low-hanging fruit in the sense that there generally hasn't been residential development around those strip malls. So you're not going to have a whole lot of NIMBY neighbors showing up and saying, "Oh no, you can't redevelop this. It will affect my sightlines." It's a parking lot that's empty. It's just asphalt we're replacing with housing and other uses.
All right, so we got a good one. Given millennial generations now starting to form families, along with starting to hit their earnings peak, or at least certainly getting wage increases here recently, could we be on the cusp of a repeat of the 90s, which we saw boomers and the older Gen X folks, it's kind of similar point in their lives? Do you think we might actually be, kind of a longer housing boom? Certainly coming out of this underbuilding for a long period, but also hitting this, if you will, swing from the millennials that you mentioned.
I fully believe that this is possible, and what we've seen before we went into the pandemic. So home prices were appreciating pretty quickly in most of these metro areas. Millennials were still buying them because mortgage rates were really low. So homes are a lot more expensive, but with a 3.5% mortgage rate, you're able to afford those homes. So I think the problem now is that, yes, they're in their peak earning years. Maybe they have one child as opposed to 2 or 3 or whatever, not having a whole lot of children. So if they are trying to buy now, I think the issue is that, home prices have skyrocketed and mortgage rates, I don't know that we've had another time in the recent memory where mortgage rates have gone up, from, where they were under 3% in December to now 4.5, 4.75 in 4 months. That's unprecedented. So, yes, they're in that peak home buying time. It should lead to a spur of quite a bit of home buying, but with mortgage rates going up as much as they have and home prices not coming down as quickly, we probably won't see that spur. But given that mortgage rates are going up, home prices should come down. But I don't, some home prices will come down some, but I don't know they can come down a whole lot from where they were in the last 2 years, because at the end of the day, we underbuilt for a decade, and all these people want homes, and some of them are going to spend a lot more money than they should be comfortable spending, which means maybe fewer beers and cocktails and avocado toasts or whatever. But
well, and again, the long-term trends are the long-term trends, whether we're talking about migratory trends or demographics generally, or immigration and these other things. And then, as you mentioned, land use and planning and all those things aren't going to get solved, certainly on a larger level. All right, we got time for one more, and we do have a quick one, which was asking, apparently for some of the input data that you were using, did you use some things from local utilities? Obviously, they know if some of these homes are occupied or unoccupied.
We would love to get our hands on that data, but our local utilities have hidden behind privacy requirements to not share that with us. They've provided a sort of aggregated data for neighborhoods that we've used in energy efficiency studies, but we've not had like each single home, whether it's connected or not, that haven't been willing to share that data with us. So what we look at is we just get data from the county that shows a sale being registered on the deed. And Yeah, well, if it's not occupied, but somebody bought it, like we don't care, it's sold, so it's not sitting.
A sale to
Uh,
sale. They're gonna do
mhm,
something with it. They didn't buy it just to have it sit there.
correct.
Yeah. Mervin, thank you very much. Very much appreciate it. And
No
for
problem.
our
Thanks for
regular,
inviting me.
absolutely. And for our regular guest, our next webinar, as Ibrahim mentioned, is scheduled to be May 18th. So look for an email invite in your inbox near you. Have a great day and very much appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.